Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Julian Bourg, who's an associate professor of history at Boston College, where he teaches European intellectual history. He is the author of From Revolution to Ethics, May 1968, in Contemporary French Thought, which appeared in 2007, as well as the translation of Claude Lefort, Complications, Communism, and the Dilemmas of Democracy, also in 2007. And he is currently writing a book on the history of the relationship between terror and democracy since the 18th century. And today we'll talk about From Complementarity to Asymmetry, Algeria counterinsurgency, and the emergence of the guerrilla as free radical.
This afternoon, I would like to recount three scenes from the larger story of guerrilla warfare in the 20th century: the development of French counterinsurgency doctrine in the 1950s, the role of Regis Debray in importing Third World Revolution to the West in the 1960s, and briefly, the old debate between Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. All these scenes shed light on more general shifts underway at the time, from bipolar to minoritarian worldviews. In fact and as figuration, Algeria played a crucial role in both the development of French counterinsurgency doctrine and the late stages of the Camus-Sartre debate. Equally revealing in another way is the fact that in the midst of the Algerian War, the young Debray famously turned to Cuba and Latin America as sites of anti-imperial revolutionary struggle. In the post-war world, the figure of the guerrilla was an overdetermined icon, evoking not only anti-colonial violence, third worldism, and Western youth radicalism, but also Cold War proxy conflicts and state security practices whose legacy endures in today's counterterrorism programs. The story of guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency obviously has a deeper and broader history than France in the 1950s and 1960s. Counterinsurgency campaigns marked the 20th century as a whole. At the turn of the century, French officers in Indochina, Madagascar, and then Morocco were focusing the colonial role of the army through the practice of what they called the oil stain, the army controlling population centers and then seeping out into ever larger surrounding areas. Parallel strategies were developing at the same time in the Boer War and the Philippine-American War. Later, guerrilla and anti-guerrilla tactics were widely used in the European and Asian theaters of the Second World War, and during the early Cold War, in the Philippines, again, Malaya, Korea, Iran, Kenya, Cyprus, Greece, and Guatemala. In none of those places, however, did counterinsurgency strategy develop into the powerful politico-military doctrine that it did in French Algeria. That well-known doctrine, guerre révolutionnaire, was developed by French army officers facing defeat in Indochina. In assessing this humiliation, emphasis was placed on the strength of the Viet Minh's supposed ideological coherence, integrated command structure, and ability to win over the population. Propaganda had been as crucial as hard force. Early founders of the new doctrine, like Lionel Max Chassin and Charles Lachois, stressed the theories of Va Nguyen Giap, the victor of Dien Bien Phu, and especially Mao Zedong, the wizard behind the curtain. The phrase guerre révolutionnaire was taken directly from Mao's 1937-38 writings on guerrilla warfare, partially translated into French in 1950. By 1954, Chassin was speaking of the ideological role of the army as a guardian of values, and Lachois was reflecting on the lessons of Revolutionary War. For these and other mid to late 1950s proponents of guerre révolutionnaire like Jacques Hogarth, Jean Nimot, and Roger Tronquier, the primary lesson was to respect one's enemy enough to learn from him. Communists knew how to fight total war. Universal, political, ideological, and military, involving soldiers and citizens. The guerrilla army, Mao famously said, related to the general populace like a fish in water. The prize was to win the sympathy and support of the population. And unlike the French army, communists did not have to deal with the feckless politicians of the Fourth Republic. Rather blindly, French
It's not me.
It's not you.
This is only being broadcast to the whole world.
Yes. How do we turn this off? Anyone?
Leave it. We can read over your shoulder.
No, that's okay.
You can just sit.
Suggestions?
Probably, can you try this little box over here to your right?
something.
Here? Nope. Wonderful. Well, now it's true that I'm balding. I'm convinced.
Just accept your fate.
God, it's mimetic. It just goes and goes and goes. Where was I? The feckless technology of MIT. Rather blindly, French interpreters of Guerre Révolutionnaire saw anti-colonialism above all as the result of communist conspiracy. France was, of course, exceptionally well placed to confront this global threat. In contrast, American containment strategy failed to take communism seriously, and atomic weapons were powerless to stop subversive and proxy wars, a position reinforced by the fact that France did not have the bomb. Colonial warfare was thus the new model for war in general, of who armies fought and how they should fight. Simple distinctions based on models of interstate war between war and peace soldier and civilian were simply antiquated. Guerre Révolutionnaire thus had universal applicability, and the French army a new grand vocation. Tired of defeat since 1940, recalling its pre-1914 colonial strategies, the military vigorously applied its new theory in Algeria, for instance, with the Salon Plan between 1959 and 1961. The only way to defeat communist insurgents was to fight like them. Revolutionary war called for mirror in reverse, or as some proponents declared unapologetically, counter-revolutionary war. The French army, too, was to focus on political tactics, psychological operations, propaganda, re-education, and demoralization.
I'm not sure what.
Can we just make this go away?
Oh,
Turn it all off.
yes. Let me go to the room.
Well, yeah.
It went just like this in rehearsal. The French army, too, where was I? The French army, too, focused on political tactics, psychological operations, mobile networks of small posts and units, encadrement, quadrillage, popular self-defense, and what Mao had called parallel hierarchies involving local agents and centralized command structures. Like the Front de Libération Nationale, the French army sought to win over the population, biopower mediating the contest of sovereign and counter-sovereign power. Above all, counter-revolution required ideological coherence. Whether Western humanism, Catholicism, or French integralism, propaganda was for one's compatriots as well as for indigenous populations. The point is that according to this strategic theory, revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, guerrilla and anti-guerrilla forces reflected one another. The tactics of the army and FLN interwove features that were violent and non-violent, physical and moral, military and political, and the explicit language of these strategists was destructive and constructive. As Marie-Catherine Villatoux has commented, political action and violent action were to be complementary and acted upon simultaneously. The limit of complementarity, however, was found in the fact that for the French military, no negotiation with the enemy was possible. According to La Guerre Révolutionnaire, ideologically motivated force was the only language revolutionaries understood. Thank you, Dan. A second limit, internal to counter-revolutionary strategy, emerged in the tilting of the political-military balance toward the military, challenging civilian authority. One 1957 pamphlet called From Revolutionary War to the War of National Liberation referred not to the anti-colonial national liberation of Algeria, but to the army's liberation of France from its internal enemies. Not all Guerre Révolutionnaire theorists were ultras who joined the Organisation d'Armée Secrète, but many were. General Maurice Schall, for example, quoted Mao at his trial for sedition. Having combined colonial national defense with a sense of renewed global mission, Guerre Révolutionnaire doctrine came apart in the early 1960s with the end of the Algerian War and de Gaulle's turn toward nuclear strategy, the first atomic test having taken place in Algeria in 1960. After 1962, the theory was treated in France as a universal modality of conflict since the religious wars of the 16th century. Minus its unifying political vision, its tactics were promptly applied by the United States in Latin America and Vietnam. And here I'll simply note that one figure who was important in the translation from France to American policy, David Glalula, was actually, his writings were unknown in France and some were only translated in the past several years. The Doctrine de guerre révolutionnaire is undergoing intense study in France today. There was just a conference in Paris this past Tuesday and Wednesday on the topic. Now, a further mutation in the figure of the guerrilla in the French cultural and political imaginary relates to the experiences of Regis Debray. Son of right-wing lawyers active in the resistance, Normalien, participant observer of Latin American Revolution, champion of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, Bolivian prisoner, witness to Salvador Allende, critic of the French far left, defender of Charles de Gaulle, advisor to François Mitterrand, medialogue, iconoclastic big R Republican who paradoxically sees religion and belief at the heart of social life. Debray has never fit easily into familiar categories and storylines. He has always styled himself as a radical à part, a free thinker beholden to neither party nor creed. No one did more in the 60s than Regis Debray to promote the figure of the guerrilla as an affirmative identity for Western militants. Now, although Debray was sensitized to the Algerian conflict, he was 14 when the war began and 22 when it ended, this seems not to have been the crucible event of his young life. That was the April 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, which inspired he and friend Bernard Kouchner to go to the Cuban embassy in Paris and volunteer to go defend the revolution. The embassy turned down their offer, but that summer Debray went to Cuba on his own anyway, beginning the journey, as Donald Reed put it, from France to Bolivia and back. And so the mention of Cuba, I will channel my inner Mario Rubio. Thank you. Debray, that wasn't it. Debray was obviously not alone in making Latin America a main screen for projecting radical politics, especially prior to the arrival of American combat troops in Vietnam in 1965, when the focus shifted. The Cuban Revolution generated support in ways the FLN never could. Sartre's 1960 visit to Havana had been an international media event, and in 1963, Henri Alleg, public face of torture in Algeria, wrote a swooning account of victorious Cuba. Between 1963 and 1965, Debray visited every country in Latin America except Paraguay. His writings at this time celebrated guerrilla warfare as an antidote to European theoreticism. Che's FOCO theory and the Cuban slogan, "The revolution is a praxis which forges its ideas in action," were circulating throughout the continent. In his 1963 report from the Venezuelan guerrilla, Debray highlighted the guerrilla's continuous struggle to eat, drink, and survive. Existence as resistance was the Archimedean point of guerrilla life, enabling autonomy, mobility outside party structures, and defensive and offensive armed struggle, the cement for unity. Small in number, often based in rural settings, their exemplary attacks tempered by constant retreat, revolutionary guerrillas seldom followed the scripts of interstate war. They favored tactical asymmetry in lieu of strategic reciprocity. In a seemingly unconscious reference to French army strategy, Debray said that the guerrilla, quote, is as patient and inexorable as a spot of oil. Once he sticks, he only needs to expand to meet with ever more favorable conditions. The Normalien student of Louis Althusser found it immensely liberating to march in the jungle with a backpack. He was welcomed. Anybody who wants to fight for the revolution has a place there, he remarked. That was not something that could have been said of Algeria. In 1966, Castro invited him to Havana to attend the Tricontinental Conference and write the book that made him famous, Revolution in the Revolution, Armed Struggle and Political Struggle in Latin America, published in 1967. That year was the turning point. In April, Debray was arrested in Bolivia, accused of conspiracy with guerrillas led by Che, who was killed that October. In November, Debray received a 30-year prison sentence. In prison, he reflected on the limits of FOCO voluntarism, on the distinctiveness of Bolivian history, and above all, on his own particular experiences. Writing in the first person was a new voice that broke with his earlier stance as sympathetic observer and publicist. While studying with Althusser at the École Normale in the early 1960s, he had gone so far as to make a pact with his best friend never to use je in conversation. But there was nothing like interpolation by a Latin American state apparatus to foreground one's subject position as a French citizen. In his first few months in jail in May, June 1967, Debray wrote an engaging account of his student days. More to the point was his courtroom defense speech that November, later published as, "I regret that I am innocent." In that speech, Debray cleverly declared his sympathies with Che's guerrillas while claiming that he had merely been an observer and visitor who had not engaged in violent action. Even though he had wanted to join the guerrillas, intentions were not criminally liable. Che had refused to involve him because he was sick and had a, quote, lack of experience in living in the wilds. Debray concluded that he would be much more useful on the outside than the inside. Although we now know that Debray was lying, he later admitted to carrying messages from Castro to Che. The key move was to personalize the proceedings, and here's the essential quote, which is a bit long. "This entire trial is apparently directed against me personally. I am in no way authorized to represent anyone but myself. Guerrilla warfare is being tried here through me. They have created a defendant to fit the trial they had planned. They have lifted me out of the most terse anonymity and raised me to the suspicious and undeserved notoriety, a great honor for one man." Here, the extremes of self-abnegation and self-aggrandizement met. Debray was an unattached free radical, a first-world supporter of the Bolivian insurgency, admitting ideological crime while denying that he sought, quote, any kind of immunity owing to my profession as a writer, an intellectual. He would accept the consequences of his actions. When he learned that Che had been killed, he changed his plea to guilty. But the fact remained that he had not done anything subversive. He wished he had, but regretfully, he was innocent. What stands out in this moment is Debray's own asymmetrical relationship to Latin American revolution itself. His trial accelerated worldwide sales of Revolution in the Revolution, giving birth to Debray, the romantic media icon and cause célèbre. Debray was released from prison in late 1970 and spent 3 years in Chile before returning to France. One of the lessons he brought with him was that the guerrilla thrives in local circumstances. Earlier suspicions about importing foreign political models into Latin America were now applied to France. Insistence on the importance of distinctly national histories, which he had figured out in the jungles of South America, now culminated in his embrace of specifically French socialist traditions. He denounced nomads on the far left who were still enchanted by third worldism, a considerable irony since he had epitomized the peripatetic exotic radical. But the romantic media icon quickly turned into the prickly media critic. In a 1974 assessment of Che's guerrilla warfare, he railed against the fact that he had become, quote, the sandwich board holder of this advertising brand. That same year, he settled accounts with guerrillaism in his book, Critique of Arms. Latin American revolutionary guerrillas had been naively voluntarist, underestimating the power of national differences and the need for focos to connect to the general population. After expatriation, Debray clearly longed for inclusion. The insider had turned outsider and returned to cultivate the role as insider as outsider. In 1980, he hyperbolized that, quote, the intellectual is a professional exile. In 1988, he declared, the conclusion I drew from all that time in Latin America was that one should stay home. One cannot at the same time preach the struggle against foreign imperialism and not be from the same country. To make sense of these very different scenes from the story of guerrilla warfare, French military guerre révolutionnaire strategy, and the roaming radicalism of Debray, in conclusion, I would like to recall the well-worn Camus-Sartre debate, because it both expresses and might elucidate the historical moment. The contours of this quarrel that ended a friendship, as Ronald Arison put it, are familiar. I agree more with Arison, who sees their debate on violence as unresolved, than with someone like David Carroll, who, as is common today, praises the lucid Camus against a caricatured Sartre. Both Camus' critique of terrorism and Sartre's critique of systematic violence have their place in moral thinking, and both thinkers also had their blind spots. More to the point, read indexically, They provide windows onto the post-war French cultural and political imaginary. Camus subscribed to the view that Algeria and France were, as the anthropologist Germain Tillion wrote at the time, complementary enemies. Terrorist action and repression, Camus said in 1955, are in Algeria an irresistible dialectic. 3 years later, he again affirmed that the destinies of France and Algeria are linked in such a way that the action of one leads to retaliation by the other. Naive about reconciliation and unable to take Algerian self-determination seriously, his position that both sides were to blame actually defaulted toward the preservation of Algérie française. Unlike the theorists of guerre révolutionnaire, however, the position of complementarity enabled Camus to consistently denounce violence in general. Everyone should put down his or her sword. Still, as disturbing as the thought is, there was a way in which the logic of mirroring and equivalence structured both Camus' arguments and those of the French army. Sartre's positions on violence certainly raise other problems. Ronald Santori is generous to say that he was curiously ambivalent on the topic. In his diagnosis of colonialism as a system of institutionalized violence, Sartre also first held to a position of complementarity. A pitiless reciprocity binds the colonizer to the colonized, he wrote in 1957. In the wake of torture revelations the following year, however, Sartre shifted his position. The French distinction between civilized force and barbaric terrorism was classic bad faith. By 1960, the year Camus died and Sartre visited Cuba, he was prepared to assert that anti-colonial terror bore an asymmetrical, not a reciprocal relationship to colonial violence, since terror was driven by fraternity and colonial violence was driven by scarcity. Counter-violence against the systematic violence of colonialism could emancipate, redeem, and humanize. In making history the final arbiter of violence, however, Sartre left himself open to the charge that anything anti-colonial insurgents did was acceptable, given the goal of revolutionary self-determination. Now, behind their obvious differences, Camus and Sartre were themselves complementary. As Aronson has observed, the climate of either-or nurtured by the Cold War and its demand to take sides led each to downplay his own contradictions with, quote, almost perfect symmetry. More deeply, both shared the search for a third way. Camus' triangulating denunciation of French and Algerian violence, Sartre's turn to third worldism. That said, such resemblances were overshadowed by the incompatibility of their positions. The shift from complementarity to asymmetry meant, in the short term, that Sartre outlived both Camus and French Algeria, and that third worldism, embodied in the figure of the guerrilla, captured imaginations throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. The more recent victory of Camus' ethical asymmetry over Sartre, the supposed cold warrior, which guides our own day, is a different story. Sartre provides a language with which to explain Debre's trajectory. In the Critique of Dialectical Reason, also published that key year, 1960, alongside concepts applicable to the figure of the guerrilla, groups in fusion, the third, fraternity terror, Sartre used the notion of the singular universal to describe the relationships between the subject and his or her historical moment. Contemplating, quote, the realization of the universal through an individual, he observed that critical consciousness in everyone takes the form of individual attempts to grasp the moment of historical totalization through one's own life, conceived as an expression of the whole. The guerrilla, in this case represented by and through Debre, mediated and embodied historical tensions, possibilities, and limits. My account has neglected that figure's essential historical field, Latin America. As tempting as it might be today to mock Debre for having been a revolutionary tourist, he was, after all, tortured. His very itinerary testifies to his engagement by and in what he called in 1965 a global correlation of forces. His singular universality expressed itself in the Free Radicals' passage from agent of globalization to advocate of French exceptionalism. So too, in a related way, the Guerre Révolutionnaire readers of Mao bore witness to universal circuits and circulations from which post-war France was not exempt. While one might be inclined to take comfort in the fact that the French colonels of Algeria bore an asymmetrical relationship to the flow of universal history itself. As Camus had foreseen, and as we all know, they pioneered a tragic complementarity of torture and terror that outlives them all. Thank you.
I will stay away from the screen.
Yeah, don't touch that screen.